So good afternoon. Thanks for coming to this seminar on breaking Latin America's cycle of low growth and violence. New research by the IDB and the International Monetary Fund explore the vicious cycle between crime and low economic growth in Latin America and the Caribbean. Increasing security leads to macroeconomic instability, which in turn leads to more crime. How can the economic and social cost of insecurity be measured? What can be done to break this cycle, reduce violence in the region, and spur economic growth? What opportunities lie ahead for regional cooperation in combating transnational crime? So to try to answer all these questions and to present, the main results of the latest report on crime, I think we're extremely fortunate to have Rodrigo Valdez, who's the director of the Western Hemisphere Department, to present the IMF report, Breaking Latin America's Cycle of Low Growth and Violence. We have as discussant Joyce Wong from the Inter-American Development Bank, also former IMF. As you all know, Rodrigo is a national of Chile. Before coming to the IMF, he was at the University of Chile, but before that, he was the Minister of Finance of Chile from 2015 to 2017. Before that, he has a long career in the Ministry of Finance and also at the Central Bank, where he was the chief economist in charge of producing the monetary policy report and advise the Board of Governors on monetary policy decisions.
Becomes so important in the region that is what we call macro-critical in several countries. And therefore, as many other topics that become macro-critical, for us, this is a topic that has macroeconomic implications that are first order, and I will try to look at them in the presentation. The other thing that for me has been important to push a bit this agenda is, as I will show later, that this is very top of mind for people in the region. If you look at the different surveys around, many people answer that security, drugs, crime, etc., are one of the topics, or the topic that is most important for the government to look at. So that also means that if you are engaging with countries, you cannot say, okay, this is something that you can just look through and not have a view on this. Unfortunately, also, crime is something that exists everywhere, but is very concentrated in Latin. There are some other areas in the world with a lot of crime, but if you look at, there's one number that actually the IDB uses a lot, that the region has 8% of total population and 1/3 of all the crimes, homicides actually, of the world. At some point they saw years ago that there were more crimes in a couple of countries in the region than in civil wars elsewhere. Okay, so let me give you a bit of this sort of introduction or a bit of motivation of why we're doing this, and basically showing you the statistics that I was mentioning. If you look at the self-report victim surveys in the region, many people answer that they have been victims of some crime in the last 12 months or something like that. So an average of more than 20% of the population. There is heterogeneity, and also there is sometimes some people get tired, so they don't really report victims of that. But this is one first part, that is first order for welfare. That's very clear. The chart in the middle shows you the number of homicides per 100,000 people in different areas. And as you see, we are well above the world average on this. Even regions that are pretty, have these problems, like North and Southern Africa, actually have crime rates are well below the region. So really, this is something that for Latin America is first order, and it's basically spread in South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, everywhere. And finally, what I was mentioning, that if you look at surveys, there's a lot of variability across countries and across time, but what is striking is that in many countries, this is top of mind in the surveys of people, 30% of people say that this is the main problem of the country, more or less. And this is pre-COVID, It dropped with COVID, it started to go up. There are countries that have done, and we will say a couple of words later on this, like El Salvador, that was really a big problem in the middle of last decade, and now it's much smaller. In others, and in the case of Ecuador here is very evident, had a shot up on concerns and also numbers of homicides. That was very big. So there's also the aspect that this is not stable. Some things can be done, but also that you can lose control of the situation very quickly, as the Ecuador case shows. Anyway, so that this basically shows you that this is an issue that seems to be very important. Now, is it now beyond being important politically for welfare, macroeconomically relevant? There is some literature that shows that it is. For example, there's a report by the UNDP showing that the direct welfare cost of crime can be between 10 and 15% of GDP, and in some cases it's pretty high. There are material losses that you have to spend in private security, health costs, etc. There are also indirect costs that are not here, but that are more speculative in general, although we're making progress in understanding them. There are effects on employment, in investment, integration, for example, in trust in the government, and governments directly. And there is some literature linking crime and growth, and that literature shows that crime basically hinders growth. One number here is that 10% of homicides reduces growth by 0.5% per year. That's our bank paper that is not very recent, but I will go back to that in a second. This is not a trivial thing to disentangle because you have a lot of dual causality here, So homicides and insecurity produces low growth, and low growth probably produces insecurity and problems. So how to disentangle? One way is to find the correct econometric instrument is part of the challenge. Well, and finally, what I would like to mention in this introduction is that we have been pushing this in the department strongly in the last year and a half, I would say, and we are seeing some progress. So I will basically base my presentation in this departmental paper, and I want to thank especially Niels Hansen, who prepared the presentation. How to disentangle correct econometric instrument is part of the challenge. Well, and finally, what I would like to mention in this introduction is that we have been pushing this in the department strongly in the last year and a half, I would say, and we are seeing some products now. So I will basically base my presentation in this departmental paper, and I want to thank especially Niels Jacob Hansen, who prepared the presentation, who is part of the co-authors, but there are many others, and Rafael Espinosa here is another guy who pushed this project, that they put some resources to study this, and has been useful to learn a few new things. Also, I will mention in passing, the next slide, I think, this publication that is our annual regional economic outlook has a paper in the 2023 edition, has a small piece trying to answer the question of how much growth costs the issue of of insecurity. And finally, I want to point that Article 4 consultation reports are starting to talk a bit more about this. So for example, in Ecuador, in Mexico, there are sections discussing the effect of this. And I will show you a couple of those later. So basically, I'm not presenting new material here. I'm basically trying to bundle a bunch of things that we have been doing in the Western Hemisphere Department for some time. Okay, let me show you one first thing that this is it's not the last one. It's this regional economic outlook presentation that we had about a year and a half ago. And we started with the question, okay, what's the cost and what are the channels through which insecurity affects growth? And here comes the issue of how to get a good estimate when you have this dual causality and these problems. And what really we do here is to follow previous work in the department, that the tricky thing here is to have something that correlates with crime across countries and across time, but doesn't correlate directly with output, with growth. No? And that, in this case, is the idea of using the basically the people that are expelled from the US because of crime reasons. So you have a series by country of deportations crime-related. And what you observe in the first stage, for those who know more econometrics, is that in that first stage of the two-stage least square regression is that if you expel more crimes from the US to one country, you see later on in that country basically crime going up. Okay, so it seems to be a valid instrument. And with that, you can then start asking yourself, okay, what's the effect of crime into inactivity? And here are basically the semi-elasticity, is more capital accumulation, labor force participation or TFP growth the effect, and it happens that capital accumulation and TFP growth matter. So when you have more crime, you have less growth, and the channels seems to be these two. And finally, you tend to spend more money in security when this happens, okay? How big are these effects? Well, they're relatively big. If you were to drop the gap between homicides rates in the region fully to the world economy average, so it's basically you bring these bars to the orange line, that would mean that on average, the region will grow about 0.5% more every year. Of course, this cannot be forever. We can discuss sort of more the technicalities, no? So I used to say for 10 years to have a round number. But it's something that you don't have very easily with other covariates, no? This is large, half percentage point. Of course, if you reduce less, you have some positive effect that is smaller. Also in Central America, and is bigger the effect because they had more crime at the moment, okay? So bottom line here is that the effect seems to be large and sort of aligned with the World Bank result that I showed you before. So just to sum up, and if you want, this is the view that we had a year and a half ago. Crime seems macrocritical, so we should try to bring it to our discussions with countries in a way that we can be useful to, no? Of course, and I will repeat this, we will never be experts in crime. We're macroeconomists. We cannot say whether it's good one way to have security or another one. But we can start treating this as other things that macroeconomists look that are important for the economy. What are three things that matter a lot from the fund perspective and the IMF perspective? Well, first is stability, no? And macroeconomic stability, both domestic and external. Because of growth, it's important. And also there is some external effect here that has not been studied too much yet, but I think it's interesting, is that basically the money flows out and inside. There is some study on spillovers through migration, okay? How migration, so you escape basically from areas where more insecure. A second big part is fiscal positions, no? We spend quite a bit of money in security, both privately and from the government side. And there's also an effect on tax revenue in general, because you end up doing activities that do not pay taxes. It's not that the band that does drug dealing is paying taxes at the end of the day because of the activity. No? So that's another part. And finally, there is regional spillovers that are interesting through different channels. No, migrants I mentioned, there are conflicts that you export, and flows of drugs that go through different regions and different countries. In fact, I'm increasingly convinced that the effort on this needs to be much more cross-country coordinated. Okay, one country alone can do a lot of things, but it's not enough. And I will show you also some evidence that points to that at the local level, really. Okay, so that's my motivation. Okay, this matters. And 1.5 years ago, we decided to basically say, okay, let's put even more effort to this agenda, and let's start doing in Article 4, for example, sections on security, try to convince counterparts in the countries to discuss a bit this. It's very interesting. Some authorities are more interesting than others. I think it's a topic that is not super comfortable to discuss. Some are more sort of, they don't want to discuss too much, but some others have plenty of, they're very conscious that this requires a lot of policy action. Just as an example, and again, to showcase a bit what we do in the department, this is a study in the Article 4 for Ecuador. And they show how the Ecuador sort of spike of problems of security started to spill over towards Colombia locally. Okay, so there's analysis with very local data, and I will come back to local data, something that is very important and rich, that they have this. No, in Mexico, there are a couple of things that are very interesting. If you look at standard data, and I showed you that before, I think security and labor force participation doesn't have sort of a very, very strong correlation, okay? Perhaps even lagged. So you have crime in one quarter, in the next quarter, labor force participation in total doesn't change much. But, and we discovered this through research really, the effect is completely asymmetric. In Mexico, at least, men dropped from the labor force and women increased labor force participation. So there is quite a bit of action that before that we didn't know. And this other part in this Article 4 for Mexico looked at basically the spending and the cost for a firm of insecurity. No? And there are two things. One is safety spending, and the other one is losses from crime, okay, directly. And this basically orders firms by size. Here are the very small firms, here are the bigger firms. And the blue line is how much they spend in Social Security, just to have a benchmark of how much is the cost of this. This is, of course, the share of sales, no? So that gives you already a cost. But what is amazing is that many, many firms, so I would say the half of smaller firms, spend more in security and lose more from crime than what they spend in Social Security. Only when you go to very large firms, you have sort of a more aligned result for what you would have expected. So again, heterogeneity here seems to be super important, no? Well, Let me move then to this departmental paper where basically we try to tackle two broad questions. One is, what is the impact of crime in the economy? What factors accelerate this or make this smaller? And what can policymakers do about this? Again, we're not giving specific advice nor studying security policies, okay? That's something that others should do. That I have to recognize also that the IDB was the only IFI which was doing this for a long time. They have a group of experts. Also, La CEA has a group of economists doing this, but the group is not big enough given the importance. A bit like as a joke, but a bit seriously. I told a couple of friends who are labor economists and also education economists, that they do a lot of papers about education and about labor market. So look, instead of doing your paper number 55 in education, why you do your first paper on security? And probably we can learn a lot. So microeconomists are invited here to do much more on this. There are many, many questions that are unanswered. So here it will be more a macro perspective and a bit of a more fun perspective, but there's a lot to be done. Okay, so impact of crime on economies. Let me start from one basic fact that I think it was clear in the first slide and also when I show you Colombia and Ecuador, but still is striking. This is the fact that between countries, there is some heterogeneity, okay? It happens that between municipalities in the region, the heterogeneity is 7 times higher, okay? So although one country seems safer than other and much safer than other, within a country, the heterogeneity is immense. So there's a lot to be done internally in countries and a lot to be learned, no? If you ask what are sort of some determinants of where crime locates, super important that country borders matter a lot and coastline matter a lot. So there is some issue with drug industries, basically, around this that is critical to understand where you have more crime. And also a highway, same reason. No? So all this is very correlated to the drug issue. And then there is some characteristic of the population there, and this is not surprising, no? But very clearly, when people have less education, and especially when you have young people, you may have much more crime. I will come back to this, but one sort of policy implication of all this is what do we do with young unemployment, young perspective for young people perspective for the labor market, and whether you need to protect much more education at that level and the labor market. No, this aspect seems to be super important. And being urban is also correlated to where it is. Okay, that's a bit where crime is more prevalent. Then we asked again, okay, what can we say about economic activity? What else can we say? And the team here did something very cool, I found, that is to look at, given that we have a lot of local data on crime, how we can measure local activity. One way to do it that is not here, but I think it's useful to have in mind, is that there are some countries with good, for example, tax data by municipality or something else. I have a paper on earthquakes and local effects through that, so it works. Here they use another thing that is basically the night lights as a proxy of economic activity. No, you have probably seen other papers that use night lights for different things. One that is very cool, by the way, is a paper that tries to see whether in dictatorships or in democracies, how is this correlation between daylight and so the bottom line there is that in dictatorships, they have more GDP than what the light shows, and more growth than this. So they sort of cook a bit more the GDP numbers, I guess. Well, anyway, there is sort of a relationship between light and GDP, if you want. So you can, by measuring light and the effect of crime in light, you can say, okay, the activity behind this is this and that. And when you look at this now with all the municipalities that we have, et cetera, if when we do this with fixed effects and different methodologies, we get elasticity of about minus 0.4. That is really similar to what we got before with a completely different methodology of this. If you close the gap of homicides to the average of the world, you grow more or less 0.5%. Well, that number seems to be readily credible at this stage. It could be a bit larger, though, locally, okay? Because one thing is how you grow on average, and the average here is not high and it's not significant. But this one here, the problem that it has is that it masks this problem of dual causality that we have. This one here is one that has one instrument. This bar here is only Ecuador, because we have the instrument only for Ecuador, but all the municipalities. That's basically how congested are the local courts, okay? With more congested local courts, you cannot get more people to jail, et cetera, et cetera. And it's super interesting because if you do this regression without the instrument, so if you run just an OLS here, the number is 0. Okay, so only with, in this case in particular, only with the instrument you are able to identify an effect. And this effect is bigger, okay, than before. Now, what we have to be careful though, is that these are local effects. So displacement here also matters, no? You can have more security, more activity in one place, but the bad guys, quote unquote, move to the next neighbor, and you have the problem there, no? So the local thing is super interesting, but has that problem. Thinking of more alternatives to measure, no? Because people have some doubts about crime data, although homicides are pretty good, no? People really report crime, homicides. But the team did something different. That was, okay, it's not only crime what matters, it's the perception that matters. So how to measure perception? They went through this counting of news. That is, I guess, the first people who did this was with policy uncertainty and all that literature that already has about 10, 15 years, where basically you count in newspapers in history the share of some keywords, no? So for policy uncertainty will be the word uncertainty, et cetera, et cetera. Here will be violence, homicides, et cetera, et cetera. And you can count the relevance of that type of words in the entire newspapers. And the nice thing of this, that with machine learning and all that, you can do this for several years, several newspapers, several countries, et cetera. And this is basically the history of this, no? Interestingly, Ecuador is here, again, with a huge peak at the end. El Salvador had this huge peak and now much lower. This can be followed. So we are not maintaining this in real time, but we could do it. I mean, and if anybody wants this data, ask the authors and they can have the data. And with this data, because we have now a more high frequency indicator of perceptions, we can try to look at what happens with, for example, industrial production. And what we observe is that basically 3/4 after peaks of this, you have at least transitory lower activity. So 10 percentage points of this news reporting makes industrial production to drop between 2 and 3% after the shock. Okay, so that's part of what we have been learning. We have been also learning about the firm's reaction in this environment, and there are different things here, no? With different surveys that are around, we can ask, for example, something that I show you already for Mexico, but for many countries, we can have how much money are they losing, how much money are they spending in security. And again, money is high, larger firms spend less. Even in Mexico, we can ask whether the presence of gangs in the local place matter or not for this, and it clearly matters, no? In a place with gangs, firms lose about 4 times more money than when there are no gangs. And finally, on this sort of effect of crime, these surveys also can show or can allow us to ask what is the implication now for basically productivity, for innovation, etc. And the effects are big, no? So basically, crime perception is associated with much lower investment, both in productivity and spending in new projects. So bottom line, this has big effects. There's many questions that are pending, but at least I'm increasingly convinced that this is a first order problem that we're facing in the region. The next question is, what can economic policymakers do about crime? And let me stress economic policymakers that are our usual counterpart. No, I don't want to discuss this with the Minister of Interior, who is in charge of this and has a lot to do with our microeconomics friends. And that's fine. That's an agenda that we have to push, and they have to deliver, no? But when you go to talk to the Minister of Finance or the central bank authorities, what we can say about this? Well, the first thing is that really macro matters. Macroeconomic results matters. Let me just show, with inflation, you have more crime. With lower growth, you have more crime. With more inequality, you have more crime. Okay, so big numbers matter in terms of determinants of crime. Also, it matters a lot, something that is pretty endogenous to everything. And first order, there is rule of law, no? Rule of law affects the macro and this other thing. So, but I just wanted to mention this, that for keeping the macro in check, not only is important directly, but also through this other channel. The other thing that we need to look at carefully is spending, no? And there are different ways to show this, but to me, it's not very impressive the amount that we're spending, although it's okay. No, this is a percentage of government spending, okay? Government spending in the region is generally small, so probably we are underspending given the problem that we have. Now, there's not a lot of space to spend a lot more, but this shows me that in general, we're not too different from the rest of the world, and in terms of security, we're very different. So there seems to be here a space for finding ways to spend a bit more. And the structure of our spending now, if you compare to others, is that we have spending in courts that is much bigger than other places. Police perhaps is a bit less than in other places. What is better here? I don't want to enter into that. I think that's a more micro question and for others. But I don't want to leave this slide without the following question, no? Is whether the economic authorities are asking for efficiency for this spending in the same way they are asking for efficiency in other things like education or health. My experience, I was Minister of Finance. I spent a lot of time chasing the Minister of Education or the Minister of Health, trying to be more efficient or what they are doing, etc. I didn't have the knowledge to do something for this area, but it's something that requires more discipline, okay, in terms of how they spend the money. Data is pretty secret on these things also, so it's not easy to do the assessment, but I think here there is something to do, okay, and I will come back to that towards the end. By the way, there is an old question on whether spending in police helps or not. Steve Levitt, that was between Alejandro and I at MIT, wrote about this, and there are a few papers now on this, and it's tricky. But basically, what we did here, well, first is to see our spending in order and safety and homicides, and the red dots, that is the region, as I see here, do not spend a lot. Okay, spend, but not a lot. And what we observe, just identifying this through basically time, no? Because you hire here more and you wait 2 years. And in 2 years, yeah, you see some effects. My reading of the literature of this is that police help, okay? At the same time, police spending, if it's deployed in a way that is not correct, displaces crime rather than lowers crime. So not a trivial, again, way to how to do it. There's a few nice papers of using big events. For example, in Argentina, when there was the AMIA explosion, there's a paper that uses that event because they located police around the city close to that to see what happened, for example, with crime around. And they find effects, no? Anyway, this paper was done for a conference that we did together with the ADB. And I wanted to have one slide in this presentation about some of the lessons that I learned in that conference, which was interesting because we brought a few academics, some policymakers, and people that are like us that had not a lot of experience with the topic. No, we were starting to discuss. A few things are here that were very clear. No, one is how some academics look at El Salvador as an example to follow or not to follow, etc. No, because it's a place where really it's the only place where we're seeing a drop that is very important. And according to Chris Blattman, one thing that is super important is whether the bad guys are despised by the population or they are a substitution of the state and sort of help the population. In El Salvador, basically, they were super unpopular, a lot of local extortion, and that produced quite a bit of demand to keep these guys in jail. That's very different from other countries where drug dealers, drug lords really become, like in Colombia, someone who provides for the local community. No? So that's something that we have to keep in mind at the moment that we try to design, okay, this is a very interesting experience. Well, watch out for this. The other thing that Chris mentioned, at least to me was very important, and it's not directly here, no? But he said, look at the industrial organization of this, who is doing what, how the money flows, etc. and Minister Bullrich in Argentina, which is a country where actually we had an increase in crime a few years ago, but they have managed to lower it in the last couple of years. Told the experience that she has had, and she said that the judicial and police coordination seems to be first order in her view. So if the police does something, but the judicial arm does that, there's nothing that you can do really. And then there are micro strategies, things that some people are working from academia and others are working in real life. Melissa Dell basically looked a lot about incentives, super economist, but here it comes back the issue of safety nest and education for young people. This was the experience also of Minister Palencia, who is the Minister of Interior of Ecuador, and Vega, who is the Minister of Finance of Ecuador. It was super interesting to have them both super aligned and with the same strategy, looking at youth unemployment and youth recruitment as the critical aspect that they are trying to tackle. Micaela Sbiacci, who is I think she's visiting Georgetown this year, Princeton professor, has several very interesting papers, but basically one super microeconometrics, well done, etc., showing that schools are a very safe place. So how to keep kids in school is super important. And finally, something that we are starting to work a bit more is the role of policies that follow the flow of money and try to do anti-money laundering, basically. We had one of the chiefs of the Italian Polizia de Finanzas. Super interesting because in Italy they have the Carabinieri, but there is basically an armed body that depends on the Ministry of Finance to do this stuff. And remember, they have dealt with quite a bit of crime in Italy for some time now. So this idea that the Ministry of Finance is completely detached of the issue, they show that it matters. Okay, let me try to conclude with a couple of slides. One is that we're facing a macrocritical issue. We need much better data to inform what's happening. Economic policy matters. So another reason to be careful. We need to support the security sector more, probably scaling up and having more efficiency on security assessments. We need to evaluate more. And of course, always you come back to institutions sometimes, with the judicial, etc. What are we doing? Because this is an agenda that is huge. It's not macro. So at least I want to share what is our view of next steps. So one thing is to try to work more on data. We have an arm in the fund that we ask for data, and we're starting to work on that. Second is to work with the other IFIs. Joyce probably will tell you about the regional alliance that the IDB is doing, which is very interesting. But basically, we need to work together on this. This is not an agenda for one institution. It's really, really something that many have to be involved. The second thing in our surveillance part is that we can use this data. We can start studying more what is the impact on crime. For example, tourism is something that is very obvious. And again, analysis of security sector spending. And in terms of policy advice, here I want to repeat the issue of the role of Ministers of Finance securing efficiency for each peso, dollar that you spend. In this case, is super important. There are some issues with public financial management, but the most that we can do probably from the fund is to scale AML CFT to a next level in the region. We are very much into a minimum for everybody, and that's fine. There was a first step, but I think we can go beyond compliance and try to understand better what type of AML CFT policies can really help on this. Because probably the problem is so big that one tool will not make it. It's not enough to have kids in the schools. It's not enough to have more police. You need to also follow the money. Let me stop here and thank you again.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo. I know it's trite to say like this is a paper I wish I had written, but I really mean it in this case. And Alejandro knows, he was my boss for 10 years. We actually looked into it when I was a baby economist at the IMF working in Central America, because in a sense, you know, we were not able to demonstrate fully the macro criticality of crime. But we all felt it, right? We would work in El Salvador, we would work in Honduras, we would work in Guatemala, I would work in Jamaica. What would everybody tell us? Crime. Crime is an issue. Can the IMF help us? Can we do something about crime? And at that stage, you know, it was myself, a colleague of mine, Dmitry Plotnikov. We were like, he was working on Honduras. We're like, there must be something we can write. Alejandro let us do this. Like by then it was crazy. Nobody like would have connected those two. So we're able to do some work on it. And indeed it's wonderful to see when this paper came out. I totally sent it to everybody. I was like, crime, we're doing it. So what is special about this to me personally? It brings an economic policymaker's view to crime. It's an economic variable. It's influenced by fiscal, monetary, structural policies. And in turn, it actually has the power to be influenced by them. So the question is really, if economic policy affects crime, which clearly it does, how does crime in turn affect economic policy making? So in which ways do we have to turn the mindsets of policymakers and economics to take into account crime? Not even asking, thinking about it every day, but to not forget it type of thing. Crime, Latin America, I think the super striking number that Rodrigo quoted, less than 10% of the world population, 1/3 of global homicides. It's so striking that all we have to do is basically say that to say Latin America is in many ways stands out, not in a good way in this issue. And if crime matters somewhere, it must matter in this region. So let me try to bucket this in a few main points that I want to make about this. First, the crime following economic cycles. As a macroeconomist, it's striking to see on how in recessions, we do see an increase in homicides. There is, and the fact that it's a pattern that you don't see in other regions is really, really interesting. Again, something about Latin America and makes it super important. And the other point that I thought it was really interesting, and Rodrigo presented a little bit, is how inflation also links to homicides. We all know inflation is bad, right? Price of eggs, everybody. We've all been talking about the price of eggs in the US. But to see that connection, it tells you that there is something more. As real wages erode, as opportunities erode, there's something deep and almost insidious that is happening to the crime dynamics. So to me, one point that Rodrigo mentioned, the impact on governance, employment, investment, migration. This to me is scarring, right? One way to kind of think about it is crime, economic recessions and crime create scars. And this leads to impact that is permanent or for intergenerational, right? Homicides is very clear that there's a scarring effect here. Lives are lost, But more than that, a young person who joins a gang because of an economic downturn, because there's a need to help support the family, this will then lead to an impact through his own family, his own intergenerational impact. So the children he may or may not have, or she may not have. So this is how I think of it also as economic scarring that comes from crime. So, and, macroeconomic policy, we don't usually frame it as crime prevention. It almost sounds kind of weird to say it that way. But it's, as Rodrigo pointed out, that keeping the macro in check it's in a sense crime prevention, right? By showing that stability, economic stability actually is a good preventative for crime, kind of makes us think of macro policy as crime prevention. So as I said before, maybe I'm not asking that like think about it every day as an a policymaker, but at least don't forget it. And one point that I want to bring out here is Rodrigo mentioned keep the macro in check. And I was thinking, well, sometimes the macro goes off the rails. And it is at the IMF that I worked on both the Jamaica and the Argentina program. And when the macro goes off the rails, that's also a question. We know, or we've seen from the evidence, that there is a link to crime. So how should policymakers think about this? Do we have room for the social spending that he emphasized so often, on the need to keep the youth engaged, to have the social spending, to create opportunities? These are all difficult questions. These are usually, if the macro is not doing well, there's very little fiscal space. It's not like governments can dish out money and help prevent youth from engaging in crime. Governments have to make choices. And I'll leave this here because I don't have an answer. I'm just putting this on the table. One last example before I go to my next bucket is I want to point out here on the Jamaica program. When I was working on the Jamaica program, when we were doing it 2016, the authorities wanted crime to be citizen security to be a point of it. And we had structural measures in it to help citizen security because the government also instinctively knew that during the economic crises that Jamaica has gone through, and most of you are young, you've probably only heard Jamaica now as like the prime example of a success story. When we were working on Jamaica in 2013 onwards, it was not. So then there was a sense of opportunity for the youth that we had to somehow take care of the youth during the recession. So the program actually had some measures directly on citizen security. Let me now go to my second bucket of big ideas about the paper. And it's the measurement. It's the measurable impact of crime. Rodrigo mentioned money flows, and one area that we haven't really looked that much, and we don't know that much. And this is where Djibouti comes in useful, Alejandro. Working in Djibouti and looking at the balance of payments, there was always a huge amount of unaccounted money, that there was way too much money entering the country. You couldn't track it based on everything the country was selling. It was cut. Cut is this leaf that you chew, very popular in the Middle East. And people told me I would be offered cut. I would have not been offered cut, so I cannot tell you how it is. But it was large amounts of cut flows that nobody would tell you openly. It would just show up as an error and errors and omissions. But the numbers were humongous, and they were consistently humongous. So little things like this, it's almost like economic crime, like crime solving. You're looking for little clues. So that is another interesting point. And I'm sure Latin America has examples. I just didn't work directly with any. The second point I want to bring here is perception. And Rodrigo showed the news measure, which is, and brought out the question of crime perception sometimes is almost as important as crime itself. And I'll bring here the example also of Jamaica. And this was always an interesting balancing act while working on a tourism-heavy country. How much did they want to advertise that there was a crime issue versus not wanting to advertise that they have a crime issue and therefore deter tourists? Which then links to self-reporting. I noticed that Jamaica was one of the lowest self-reported on crime too. And then it all links to how do we measure crime? It's one of the most difficult questions here because economic variables, most people, there's no shame, there's no heaviness associated with most economic variables. People will report them. Crime, we all know many people don't report being victims of crime for 1,000 different reasons. And we all know that media coverage of crime also may not just respond directly to actual crime. It can just be other drivers. So to a lot of young, brilliant minds here, I'll put the question of measurement again, just to really bring it to the fore. And then the third point is the issue of spending, both on the private sector and the public sector. And I think the question of quantity and quality comes in here. Rodrigo showed a high amount of court spending, and he mentioned about the efficiency of spending. And it's true, even in my experience working at the IMF, nobody would question us. Like, people would be like, oh, the schools, do you think the spending is efficient here? Do we have room on the health? But nobody ever would be like, hey, Joyce, have you looked at like the Ministry of Security or like, you know, the courts or the justice system spending? Is that efficient? Never. Nobody even thought about it. Or like policing, should we be? A lot of it is also the difficulty of it. It's because we are not experts, as Rodrigo said. It's not an area that we know and we are comfortable going into. So quality versus quantity is a big thing in terms of like the public spending. And the question is judicial efficiency too, like courts. Court backlog was used as an instrument. And I thought that was interesting because, and this is my first pitch for the IDB, where I currently am. There's an interesting example on AI, use of AI in courts in Brazil, that actually sped up court backlog. So court cases went from a person had to wait 3+ years for a judgment, and it was brought down to under 2. I know it doesn't sound a lot, but it's a big difference. And think of yourselves, right? If you are a victim of a crime and you believe you're going to wait more than 3 years for a judgment, I think some people might say, you know what, I'm going to let it be. I'm not reporting it, not touching this. So technology. So bringing in the question of technology, also putting it on the table. What can technology help us do in terms of measurement, efficiency, while of course also all the guardrails about the dangers of technology and confidential data that Rodrigo himself also mentioned. Then let me go to my last big bucket, which is the inequality of crime. And I think that this is, to me, it's not that I'm trying to sound like a social warrior here. I think it's one of the unfairness of the impact of crime because it's deeply unequal. Rodrigo showed a super interesting chart that caught my eye on how female labor force participation and male labor force participation react differently. And I don't know what's the story in the paper about this, but I've heard the same idea on the female side, that female labor force, women will basically start working after crime spikes, which on the one hand, you can understand why. Potentially there may have been death. So the main money maker in the family may have actually been the person affected, or there may be fear about, for example, the males being affected by going out. And therefore, the woman who's seen as less threatening ends up stepping out and doing the job. Now, what's the issue here? As many of you know, the region, a lot of the work is informal for women. So women are earning less, they're doing informal work. Very often, there's no social safety net about that work. Yes, as Rodrigo says, they also don't pay taxes, but this is very insecure type of work, which then fuels informality in Latin America. So there's a connection there to that. And of course, it affects children and raising children and intergenerational mobility. So we have between men and women, big and small firms that Rodrigo showed. And then, of course, the localized issue, the fact that certain urban areas, and this is coming from a macro institution as the IMF, once we look at countries, the impact is not that impressive. But you zoom into municipalities, and I'll go even one further. I lived in New York for 10 years. You would cross Avenue D, and it would be a completely different world. Like you go into Alphabet City in Lower Manhattan, you cross Avenue D or you don't cross Avenue D. And you could feel it. You could actually feel it on the street. I lived on Avenue C because I had no money. I was a grad student, so I definitely knew. But it really illustrates the localness, and it's odd. And I'm not a sociologist, I'm not an anthropologist, but I think that this is a really interesting question of why is it that sometimes the border's so clear in such a small area, but we do see it. And many times, if we only looking at the national, we completely miss those pictures. We think that on the average, it's fine, but you may have blocks where you may have huge levels of crime. On the other hand, let's go completely to the other side, to the transnational. Coupled with, localized, very, very localized impact, you also have the transnational. Drug trafficking, arms smuggling, money laundering goes cross countries. And then beyond geography, it crosses sectors, financial stability, governance, as I mentioned. So then put it all together, goes all the way from the very local, all the way to the transnational, all across sector, which then brings me to the alliance that Rodrigo hinted at that I would absolutely talk about here. So the IDB launched in December last year, the Alliance for Security, Justice, and Development. And Ilan, the president of the IDB, he said it beautifully. I write a lot of his speeches, and I wish I had written this line. He said, if crime is organized, we have to be organized too. And that's exactly the heart of that. It's the bringing together IFIs, but more than IFIs, bringing together countries, IFIs, ministries of security, police agencies, truly a regional and multi-sectoral response. So it was launched in Barbados, 19 countries in the region are part of it, and 11 organizations have joined. Ecuador, that Rodrigo used as several examples, is the first presidency of the alliance. And what are the pillars? And that's why I'm ending with this, is that in a sense, it brings it all together. 3 main pillars. 2, which in a sense choke pipelines for crime. 1 is protecting vulnerable populations. So choke the pipeline that feeds the young people into the gangs, into the life of crime. 2nd one is the financial flows, choke the lifelines through money. And 3rd, strengthening institutions. So 2 ways of choking the feeders into the crime, and then also strengthening the institutions that tackle crime. Let me finish by really bringing one last thing together. The mindset shift, going back to economics, crime, shifting from thinking of crime as just a security expense that countries have to tackle with, but thinking of it as a constraint that demands all sorts of interconnected solutions to tackle. Moving from short-term enforcement, and Rodrigo mentioned the examples that there are papers that show short-term enforcement matters and strengthening, but also moving towards more long-term thinking of the choking the pipelines that feed both the people and the financial means into it. I think of the short-term thing sometimes as like squeezing a water balloon for crime. Like you squeeze on one side, the people may move to a different one, the activity might move. So that's why it's needed for the holistic, systematic approach to it. All in all, loved it. Really, really loved reading it. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks, Rodrigo, for presenting this paper here, and I mean more than that for having your team doing this. Let me just very quickly maybe talk about some issues that maybe the audience here doesn't know, given how these organizations work. I mean, it might seem a little bit puzzling, thinking, well, the IMF thought about whether it was relevant to do this or not. But in a way, I mean, the IMF has a mandate that, can be resumed on macroeconomic stability, etc. The World Bank has a mandate on development. And if you infringe on the other institution's mandate, first, you're using your resources, you're spreading your resources into too many things, you might lose effectiveness. And then each institution starts stepping into the other institution. And then countries that are not facing these problems kind of say, look, I mean, then in Asia, we start working on other issues, and then we lose focus, we lose expertise. So the whole debate on whether the IMF should be working on this and being able to bring this thing to fruition and having the IMF institutionally accepting that this is relevant, I think is very good for Latin America because it's a very relevant thing for Latin America. And then moving from there to working cooperatively with the IDB and the World Bank, I think it's a huge accomplishment. The IMF was already working on many things that have to do with crime. However, from other avenues, I mean, anti-money laundering. I think the IMF is at the forefront of helping countries set legislation, set procedures, etc., to combat money laundering. And I think that's the IMF has been not at the forefront, but it has been an important institution in helping countries set up anti-corruption frameworks. So at the end of the day, I mean, corruption erodes the public sector, authorities, etc., and that opens the door for crime as well. So I think that's super important. And I think also the IFIs maintaining this issue at the top of the agendas in the countries is very important for the countries to focus on these things. And then also given that the counterparts of the IMF in the countries are the ministries of finance, that are the ones that actually decide on the budget. Having that discussion with the ministers of finance, it's very important not to let this issue drop in the agenda to item number 8 or 9 and having it at the top, given its huge economic impact that we saw, but also its huge social impact. So I think this is incredibly interesting. I think Rodrigo finishing his last comments, talking about money laundering, etc., that we need an integrated strategy. And what is happening on the research and the academics of crime, it's a little bit also what we're seeing on the academics of development. We have moved so much into things that are measurable, that are identifiable, that we have great papers in great journals that measure things that with a very good degree of precision that gives us a lot of confidence on how to distribute and how to do bed nets in some countries, but we lose sight on what are the big ticket issues that actually help a country develop or not. So how to go from all of those micro things to put them together with anti-money laundering things, to put it together with, and to have a strategy. I think it's very important, and I think we don't have it in the issue of crime. And when you talk with people in the financial sector, it's kind of, we have all these anti-money laundering rules to make up the cases to go against the criminals. And I say, okay, that's fine. But also what we want is to increase the cost of doing business for criminals. And that is like a tax on crime. And then you will put another taxes on crime. And it's also an issue of increasing risk, increasing penalties, and increasing the probability of catching the criminals. But it's a whole system that you have to look at and how to design the system to increase effectiveness. And I think he had it right. I think he hit the nail on the head with that. That's something that when you go to these discussions about crime issues, you have the policeman trying to go out and catch the criminals in the street. We know we're not going to catch all the criminals. So we need to hit them through many angles to actually be effective. And when Rodrigo was talking about the efficiency of public sector expenditure, I mean, jails. I mean, in Latin America, a lot of crime is conducted inside the jails. So talk about effectiveness. If we cannot control a small piece of land where we have the criminals actually locked down, okay, good luck in actually controlling them outside in the city. So I think that's, to me, that was the last two more points, and then we'll open up to questions. So Rodrigo can answer to your doubts. What Joyce said on AI in Brazil, I think making our courts much more efficient and effective, it's key. I mean, for economic efficiency all over the place, but obviously for the fight against crime. And there was a pretty cool experiment done in Mexico in labor courts. So our labor courts also are super clogged, and it takes I don't know how many years to have a sentence. So a bunch of economists, I mean, got a lot of data. They kind of look at the statistical distribution of different labor disputes. They created an app, and then they show the two sides of the dispute, given what they were fighting for, given the parameters that they have, what's the median, what's the mean of the sentences, and they say, okay, do you want to accept the average or the mean? And we get rid. So they created kind of an app for arbitration. And I think they saw that a significant number of cases, once that they saw the data, ended up being solved through arbitration. So thinking like, I mean, in the US, you have these courts for very small issues. I mean, using technology to actually unclog the courts to resolve small disputes makes, I think, a lot of sense. I think this paper is full of very interesting results. I will just end my comments saying that, I mean, thinking deeper into the El Salvador experience, what can work in other countries, what definitely will not work, et cetera, will be very important. And people are looking into the Salvador experience with through the polarized lenses that we have now in Latin America, but there might be things that we should not copy, and there might be some things or some lessons that can be extracted from this from this episode, and it's one case where we had a huge collapse in crime. Would be interesting to know if the fund already has seen positive economic effects coming from that. And then for larger countries such as my country, Mexico, would be interesting to know also how crime is distributed within the country. Is crime concentrated in low GDP areas? So therefore, in the big cities where GDP is concentrated, Mexico City, Monterrey, et cetera, we don't have crime. And then the effect of crime on GDP is not that large because it's not concentrated in the areas where you have, or the contamination is there because at the end of the day, crime, even if it's not fully located there, its objective is to generate rents. And so they will catch, I mean, the trains and the transport going from one place to another, et cetera. So I think also the distribution of crime within a country, I think it's, especially for larger countries, will be an interesting thing to understand the dispersion of the effect of crime on economic activity. But I mean, I wrote so many things here that I could spend another 20 minutes discussing this presentation, but I rather have maybe we can collect 2 or 3 questions from the audience, and then let Rodrigo close answering the questions and reacting to some of the comments. No? Joyce?
Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you.
We're all self-serving.
Yeah.
Hello. First of all, thank you, Dr. Werner, for putting this panel together, and thank you for speaking, giving your insights. And sorry for also focusing on Mexico. So I come from Mexico, and this is a big issue for us. But I was wondering to what extent perhaps Rodrigo Valdez and his team at the IMF looked at how political cycles also mediate in the relationship between economic cycles and violence, in this case, homicides. There is some research in Mexico about how cartels or criminal organizations increase violence in election years, right? And maybe also after an election, there tends to be an effect on economic growth because governments are adapting, and also maybe they don't know how to use the funds to fight the cartels. So there might be a relationship. And second, very practical, did your team look, and also Joyce Wong, your team, look at the effect of foreign aid in Latin America on crime levels? Thank you.
Another question?
Hi, thank you very much for coming. I'm Toby from the Master of Foreign Service Program. I was just wondering, you guys mentioned that, for example, the IMF and the IDB are not crime institutes, but sometimes there's this sort of approaching these issues from a purely economic lens within an organization can potentially overlook the social impacts of the crime or law enforcement. So, for example, discussions about AI in courts has revealed like large anti-Black biases within courts. Discussions of Bukele's sort of human rights implications of his policies. So it's great that IFIs like the IMF and the IDB are now starting to focus on this this issue. So how can they work to ensure that these go from, work with policymakers, that these go from, data points that are really interesting to policies that respect economic growth and also the social dignity of these countries? Thanks.
We have two, one here and one on the back.
Hi, I was wondering if you interviewed criminals themselves to discover their motives when evaluating the association between economic issues and crime, and like, did they individually cite any specific economic or social or political issues? One in the front.
First of all, thank you so much. My question is about El Salvador specifically and how its example. So you mentioned how gangs were rejected in El Salvador, and that made the project to obviously increase security much more effective. How do you think other countries where gangs are take the role of the state and where gangs support the local populations, what can they do? What can those states do, or organizations like IMF and the Inter-American Development Bank do to change the perception of the public towards crime organizations?
So Rodrigo and then Joyce.
Let me start from your question, Alejandro. Thank you for the comment. Super interesting. The buckets way to discuss this. Let me touch on El Salvador and whether we're seeing something. And it's amazing how tourism has started to go up strongly. So the macroeconomic effects of controlling crime seems to be, large. And there are other stuff happening at the same, many other stuff. No, but that one, at least I think is very clear. A few things that were asked here that I think I have to answer, saying good ideas. Let me put them in the discussion. Political cycles, foreign aid, for example, for crime, and perhaps a bit of the issue of gangs being closer or far away from the citizen, no? Being a provider or being a threat. Probably there's a continuum there. Those are things that are being studied by others. I would recommend Juan Pablo Luna, who was in our conference. He's a political scientist, but with a lot of work about talking with people. Okay, so it will give an approach that is very different from what economists or macroeconomists would do. And from them, he was a former colleague of mine in the university, and I learned a lot about him. And he wrote a paper here that goes beyond this issue of how people perceive, but how they interact with the politics, okay? And all the political cycle and the contamination of crime towards towards the politics, and how politics manage this, because different countries have different ways to deal with this. Is super interesting. Now, it's not a regression. No, it's not a data point. It's a completely different way. That brings me to the issue of why are you not talking to the crime, to the gangs themselves? Others do it. We should not, I mean, we have to be super disciplined to keep ourselves in our lane. That doesn't mean that we should not, we should recognize that other lanes, super valid, and we need to work together. Let me finish with one sort of thing. This is so complex that I think is super dangerous to keep only one lane. We need the interaction among different disciplines. It's super important what Alejandro mentioned, that there's no, and just to know, there's no one solution. Police matter, but probably it would be too easy if only with police you solve this. You need more stuff. By the same token, it's not enough to have good schools and the youth employed. Probably you need police at the same time. So how to balance these things is not trivial, but the bottom line for me is that we need to be very open, have respect for different views on this. Also because when you go to policies, you have to implement and you have to convince many people. So that is another part of why I think it's super important to have a view that is more across disciplines and sort of many people into this. In my own country, I was always worried that the agenda was very managed by more a sociologist view, which didn't have a solution for the short run, and that was inviting a more populist view of easy solutions in the other side. I think it's super important to try to detach ourselves from the polarized positions and say, look, this is complicated, requires many levers at the same time. Anyway, let me stop there. Just to conclude, that is super interesting, super important. We will do our best, but many other institutions, many other people from the academia, from think tanks need to be involved for this to be tackled. Perhaps, I mean, one way to put this that is a bit dramatic, but this is not a problem that we can externalize and that the elite should not tackle. No, it's too complicated and we need to everybody involved.
I don't think I have much more to say other than punting the same way. But in all, there was one question on the social impact, and I do want to stress that here. I think that is from the point of view of the development bank, the IDB, there are a lot of projects and there's a lot of questions, especially on the first pillar of the alliance of the vulnerable population. I had the pleasure of traveling to Barbados for the launch of the alliance and to hear about the programs, and I've heard about them here in the US, like violence interrupters, community-based outreach. A lot of it is, in a sense, to mend the community level. But as Rodrigo said, that alone is not going to be enough. We can have the greatest communities in the world, and there's still the attraction of the profits from crime too. So it's really a holistic approach. That was all I had to add.
Can I add one thing about really the IDB? No, first, that the leadership of the IDB on this has been super important, but I want to stress this, that they had a group working on crime for a long time, and it's the only institution in the world, I think, that had loans, policy loans, attached to crime. That is very unique, really, and so good work there.
I was at the IMF.
Well, thank you very much, Rodrigo. Thanks, Joyce, for being here. This has been, I mean, super interesting for me. And let me just commend the IMF and the IDB for working together on these issues. And thank you for coming again today after yesterday's talk as well. Bye-bye. Thanks.